What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Nerdy Professor Podcast, your go-to destination for all things black, bold, and beautiful. I am your host, the Nerdy Professor, and today we're going to look at the topic of transatlantic slave trade, discussing what effect it had on the continent of Africa as well as the enslaved people. So boom, to kick things off, let's break down what the transatlantic slave trade was all about. European nations set up a 3-destination oceanic trade route. The first leg of the journey transported goods like textiles, iron, guns, and gunpowder to the west coast of Africa. On the west coast of Africa, this cargo was exchanged for another cargo, enslaved people. The second leg of the journey, aka the Middle Passage, carried enslaved Africans to the New World. While in the New World, these human beings were exchanged for goods like sugar, tobacco, and later cotton, pretty much just raw material from the New World. Then these ships made their way back to Europe, putting the triangle in triangle trade. This trade route had a profound impact on regions like Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and Central West Africa, aka the Congo and Angola. The demand for enslaved labor transformed these regions, leading to significant social, economic, and political upheaval. Also, quick fact: the vast majority of people did not go to the future United States. Only 5 to 10% went to the future USA. The largest portion went to the Portuguese colonies in Brazil at 41%. And millions of others went to the various Caribbean islands. In the early days of the transatlantic slave trade, the West African coast was essentially the Wild West. It was a combination of commerce and conflict. European traders were arriving on their big ships, promising exotic goods, and they found themselves navigating a complex web of African kingdoms, eager to trade. But, contrary to common belief, European traders did not go deep into Africa to capture the slaves themselves. Instead, they relied on the middleman, African intermediaries that were deeply embedded in the capture of enslavement and the sale of their own people, aka slave raiders. These slave raiders often came from powerful kingdoms like the Dahomey, modern day Benin, the Oyo, modern day Nigeria, and the Asante, modern day Ghana. And they played pivotal roles. They traded enslaved Africans to European ships in exchange for firearms, textiles, and other coveted goods. The trade enriched these kingdoms, fueling their economic growth and military power. But on the flip side, it devastated smaller states and societies who were caught up in the crossfire. The Dahomey Kingdom was a formidable player during this time. Its warriors were renowned for their power in battle. They expanded their influence by capturing individuals from neighboring states and selling them to the European traders in exchange for firearms, textiles, and other goods. The trade enriched the Dahomey's coffers and bolstered their military might, transforming it into a dominant force along the coastline. Meanwhile, the Oyo Empire was known for its centralized authority and sophisticated military organization. The Oyo Empire engaged in the slave trade to boost its economy and to expand its influence. The empire's tactical location allowed it to control and facilitate the exchange for enslaved individuals and other goods to Europe. The slave trade played a part to the empire's economic prosperity and enabled it to exert a political dominance over its neighboring states. Lastly, the Asante Empire. The Asante Empire thrived off of the slave trade. The kingdom leveraged its strategic location and skilled diplomats to negotiate advantageous trade agreements with European merchants. Slaves captured in territorial conflicts or through intertribal conflicts were traded for muskets and gunpowder, which further enhanced the Asante's political leverage and territorial expansion. Enslaved Africans were often poor people, prisoners of war, or people who were just sold off to pay debt. Entire communities faced destabilization as raids targeted young, able-bodied individuals, creating a demographic imbalance that hindered agricultural productivity and social cohesion. Traditional government structures were weakened as local leaders either collaborated with slave raiders for protection or were themselves targeted for enslavement. And they were desperate for security, so some nations even turned to participating in the slave trade to acquire firearms, which intensified the conflicts and power struggles among the African states and ethnic groups. The fallout from this era continues to echo across Africa. Economically, the continent lost millions of productive citizens, stunting the development and perpetuating long-term poverty. Socially, divisions based on ethnicity and class deepened, leaving lasting scars that persist to this day. Politically, the traditional governing structures faltered, leaving behind legacies of weak states and external dependencies. The Middle Passage, lasting from the late 15th to the 19th century, was a harrowing journey across the Atlantic, during which an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the New World. 12.5 million. I want you to think about that. Olaudah Equiano vividly describes the horrors of being shackled and crowded together on these slave ships in the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. He states, "I was now persuaded that I had gotten into a world of bad spirits, and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions too differing so much from ours, their long hair, and the language they spoke, which was very different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at that moment, that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them all to have exchanged my conditions with that of the meanest slave in my own country. When I looked round the ship and saw a large furnace or copper boiling and a multitude of black faces of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow, I no longer doubted my fate, and quite overpowered with the horror and anguish, I fell motionless on the deck and fainted." Captured Africans had no idea what lay ahead of them. As most times, slavers put people from different backgrounds and different languages together so they could not communicate nor plot an escape. They only knew what was in front of them. They only knew what was in front of them. Off the coast of Senegal is the Gorée Island, a slave port town where millions of West Africans were held captive and went through what became known as the Door of No Return, where millions of Africans saw the last of their homeland. This traumatic experience left a lasting mark on the psyche of the enslaved people and their descendants. Enslaved Africans endured deplorable, horrible conditions on these slave ships. On these voyages, the enslaved Africans were packed like sardines. With little to no room to move or breathe, they were forced to eat, shit, and sleep in the same spot for the duration of the journey. Olado Equiano also states, "I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such a salutation in my nostrils as I had never experienced in my life, so that with the loathsomeness of the stench and the crying together, I became so sick and low that I was not able to eat, nor had I the desire to taste anything." On most slave ships, the ship's holdings were unsanitary. The captives suffered from several diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, depression, cruelty, and despair, to say the least. Violence against the Africans on these slave ships was so rampant. Enslaved Africans were tortured in various cruel ways. Sexual assault was so frequent during the week's journey on the Middle Passage. Many enslaved, approximately 2 million, died in the Middle Passage. If a captive died on the ship, they were thrown overboard. The inhumane treatment endured during the Middle Passage stands as a stark reminder of the depths of human cruelty and suffering. But some resisted. Enslaved Africans did not sit idly by despite the horrors that they faced. Enslaved Africans resisted in various ways, from individual acts of defiance to collective uprisings. They would also refuse to comply with orders, like eating, and they would actively sabotage the ship and the crew. Also, some slaves resisted by killing themselves. Now, suicide may seem like a crazy idea to some, but think about it. The enslaved wanted to make a decision about their life rather than let someone make decisions for them. Also, with slavery being an economic institution, by throwing themselves overboard, they were able to hit their enslavers in the pockets, where it hurts. Although, in response to enslaved Africans jumping overboard, the enslavers put up nets along the sides of the ships to prevent any daring escapes. In response to refusing to eat, the enslavers would put hot coals on the enslaved person's lips until they opened their mouths and they forced the food down. Or they would use this screw-like contraption called the speculum orum. Now, this device would force open the mouth of the enslaved African so they could be force-fed. But the use of this thing could break teeth, displace jaws, or even rip open the resistant African's mouth. Ugh. Now to Attack on Titan, because I feel like it has a lot of overlay with the beginning of slavery. I want you all to imagine being part of the Scout Regiment and staring down the Beast Titan as it hurls crushed boulders at you and your brethren. Y'all know what scene I'm talking about. Looking certain death in the face and neither buckling nor yielding and still raging on. That type of conviction that the Scout Regiment had to move forward and give Levi a chance is the same type of conviction that the enslaved had to carry, no matter what, to give their descendants a chance. It has to be an act of resistance. A lot of the enslaved Africans held that conviction in their heart. That conviction to survive, that conviction to hold on to what life you had, so they could pass on whatever they could, their culture, their language, their spiritual practices. Their stories of resistance serve as a testament to the human spirit's capacity for resilience and defiance in the face of oppression. All right, if you take nothing away from this episode, take this. The Africans sold Africans to the Europeans. Yes. But how the Europeans would treat the Africans on the ships, as well as when they get to the New World, is completely on them and completely messed up. Also, Africa lost 12.5 million able-bodied people to slavery, making it very difficult to run a continent. It's a big continent, yes, but 12.5 million is a big number, especially when you're left with old people and babies. All right, y'all. That wraps up today's episode. Thank you for joining. If you liked the episode, don't forget to drop a like and consider following the podcast for more insightful content. As always, I welcome your feedback and suggestions for future topics. Until next time, peace.